Right, I am going to kick off. We have got some more people coming through, but we've got kind of 40 or so on already. So thank you all for joining. It's great that so many of you can take the time out and prioritise this over the amazing football game that's on at the moment. And I'm absolutely over the moon to welcome Jennifer, Kelvin and Mark this evening. And we are obviously going to do all things private equity CFO. And we've got, you know, really kind of detailed kind of Q&A session. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A box throughout. We may cover elements of that through the chat, hopefully, because I've consolidated lots of questions from everybody on LinkedIn, email, and on GrowCFO app over the last few days. So we may cover some of those areas, but we will leave time for Q&A at the end. After the three CFOs have gone through their chosen mastermind questions, which obviously they prepared for. So before we do that, it would be great to kind of do a who's who and a welcome. So Mark, do you mind just giving us a quick overview first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, so good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Grafton. I'm currently CFO of a cybersecurity business called Adarma, based in Edinburgh, but with a London office as well. So I'm told the largest independent cybersecurity company in the UK, and I joined about a year ago after they were the business was bought out of a general IT company by private equity firm Living Bridge. So I'm very glad I got a couple of months with my new colleagues before lockdown hit. So still relatively new to the private equity world. It's my first private equity role. Prior to that, I was group CFO for a Canadian listed company called AMIA. And then I started my career at Ernst & Young, where I did 12 years in their, first the audit and then the transaction services team.
Thanks, Mark. Just so you say 2 months of the office before then lockdown?
I started on the 6th of January. I went on holiday for 2 weeks on the 28th of February. So yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, crazy. And Jennifer, if you mind, give us an overview, that'd be brilliant.
Hi everyone, it's good to see so many faces. I'm Jennifer Smith. I am the CFO at Wildstone. We are a digital outdoor advertising platform, backed by capital from private equity firm Digital Colony Capital, based in the US. And my background is really on the corporate finance side of the CFO track. So my background was originally in banking, and then I worked for a number of scale-ups, including businesses in the video software space owned by Premiere, which is a UK-based private equity, followed by EU Networks, which was backed by Columbia Capital, Soros, and Stonepeak, based in the US. And then for a venture-funded business, cybersecurity business in the US, which was funded by a VC firm based in the US before coming to Wildstone.
And do you mind just touching on some of the exit processes and kind of fundraising and IPO pieces you've been involved in?
I think this is one of the most fun things about working for PE-backed businesses, and without taking too much away from the conversations we're about to have, I've been through strategic sales, sold Indias to Cisco for $5 billion, and smaller exits as well, as a kind of dual track strategic exit and IPO process. So I can speak to you about small and large exits.
Awesome. Kelvin, are you still on the call? Because
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you scared me then, because I had to keep admitting you into the room, and I was like, where's he going? I just thought maybe that the eldest really was not going to bed. So yeah. It's good to have you back.
Yeah, good. Sorry about that. I moved broadband providers this week, and it's been really stable all week. And the reason I moved was because it was unstable, and it's just decided to play up. So hopefully I can get through this. But yes, I'm Kelvin Barber. I'm CFO of a business called 1,000 Heads, which is we do a bunch of things, but primarily we are a social media focused advertising agency and consultant. I've been with the business for almost 3 months now. So it started on the 4th of January. This is my first CFO role, so some of the questions that Andrew might have around sort of first CFO role and advice you'd give to a first CFO are kind of interesting. I might learn a little bit as well on this call from Jennifer and Mark. But just in terms of my career background, I started my career actually working for a private equity fund. I worked for 3i. But actually started my career in finance with them, and I was there for almost 10 years. 3i were a listed FTSE 100 business, still are a listed FTSE 100 business. I then moved on to a business called Market, which when I joined, we had just a little over 1,000 employees and $400 million of revenue. When I left, we had about 18,000 employees and about $3.5 billion of revenue. Not all of that growth was organic. We made several acquisitions, did a merger, and so on. But a really fun journey to go through a business that grew so quickly, and also was involved in an IPO. So that was good. Then I left what ultimately became IHS Market to join a business called Metaswitch. And I was the finance director or group finance director at Metaswitch, which was a number 2 role. We actually had a CFO, but I think as I mentioned to Andrew and previously, that actually the CFO was an ex-lawyer, and he kind of hired me because when I joined, the plan was to do a UK listing. So I was there for 3 years, and in July we completed the sale of the business to Microsoft, and I decided that I didn't want to go and work for a big corporate, and try and find another, growing private equity-backed business to help support the future growth.
Thanks, Kelvin. I'm sure, hopefully, the audience will agree. We've kind of got 3 CFOs from different angles here, which is partly the plan. So someone who has worked their way up from an ops perspective within a private equity firm. Someone from a big 4, maybe slightly more traditional background you would consider, and then from a corporate development, kind of investment banking type background. So I'm hoping that means that they're all going to disagree, and then therefore this will be really entertaining this evening. But I'm sure they'll agree on some things. So we've got loads to dig into. What we'll do initially, like we always do, is a quick fire round. There'll be a prize for whoever can answer these questions the quickest, because obviously that means you're most knowledgeable. I will go for the quick fire round. We'll go in the same order as we've just done the intro. So Mark, Jennifer, Kelvin, if that's okay. So first one, FTSE listed, NASDAQ listed, or PE scale up?
Listed. Canadian.
Definitely PE scale up.
PE scale up as well.
If you could have 2 external advisors, but only 2, who would you choose?
The specific individuals, Peter Watts and Ollie Wilson at Hogan Lovells are amazing. So good legal. I find accounting and finance advisors pretty much of a much, but those legal guys are great.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say some of the financial advisors are more helpful than others. My quick fire answer is someone who's spent the time getting to know the business, not someone who comes in at the last minute. Exception is for IPO processes, when it's good to have a Goldman or a Morgan Stanley by your side.
I'll allow that. It was a cheeky answer, but I think it's a good answer. So we'll green light it. Kelvin?
So I think I would go with a guy called David Evans, who's at Alvarez and Marsal. They're a transactional advisory business, hugely helpful on the recent sale to Microsoft and Metaswitch. And then probably because it's not my area of expertise, I'd choose a really good tax partner that I've worked with, a guy called Mike Seaton at PwC. And if this is recording, I'm currently using BDO, are also very good, but I've only been working with 3 months. But Mike, I had a very good relationship with over the last 3 years.
Definitely taking that name down.
If I was being completely honest, we don't normally ask for direct names. It's more a top law firm, top broker, but you know, I think hopefully there's some good cross-selling that's going to go on by here, even if no one mentioned my name and said about, you know, the amazing work that I do, but we'll let you off. Team of 10 or team of 100?
10.
The top one, but I say 10.
That's a good question, Alan. I would probably say, I'm going to be a bit cheeky here and say 20.
Yeah.
Somewhere in between.
I'm not sure that's allowed either. But before we go on to the next question, we tallied up what Mark and Jennifer and Kelvin's teams have been in terms of total size when they're in their jobs and FTSE businesses or corporates. And I actually don't know the actual answer here, but I think it was about 400 or 450. And now we tallied up their totals. And how many do you have, Mark?
I've got 8.
Kelvin? Oh, sorry. I'm in the order. You've got 8.
I've got 5.
Okay. So someone could do the maths, 21. So yeah, quite a bit less. So it'd be interesting to see how you've coped with that transition from 450 to 20 odd. So Mark, best tip coming into a new role to build a strong relationship with the CEO?
I'd say, set out very early on, understand what exactly they're looking for from you. And I think just particularly in terms of communication and getting into a good cadence and a good working rhythm.
There are 2 things for me. First of all, if you have the luxury, choose your role based on the rapport with the CEO, because it's very important. Secondly, regardless of that, I think it's important that you advocate for the CEO, understand what his bugbears are, and get behind them. His or her.
Kelvin?
I think a little bit like Mark, I think it's getting clarity really early on in terms of their working style. This is my first time I've actually reported to a CEO, but I've worked with lots of different CEOs, and some CEOs, very high level strategic. Some CEOs like to be very much into the detail and the weeds of everything, and kind of getting that clarity early on is really important. And then I think also just making sure that you build the relationship, you communicate with them regularly, and even do that before you join. So I had twice monthly meetings with my current CEO every week, every month before I joined.
Right.
1,000 heads.
That's a great idea. Just going slightly off topic on the quickfire round, but obviously you've all got personality traits and the ways that you would like to work with the CEO naturally. But you have to be a chameleon in your style. Would you go for a CEO relationship that isn't your preferred style? Would you take a CFO job if it meant you needed to be a chameleon, but not your preferred type of Mark Grafton, Jennifer Smith, Kelvin Barber?
I think I would, if it was just around, communication and operating style. Where I wouldn't compromise is if I didn't think there was a good match around sort of, values and what good looks like. Because I think that's just then hard every day to be sort of putting against that if you're just, different ends of that spectrum.
Jennifer?
I agree 100% with that assessment.
Kelvin?
Yeah, I think I would as well. It sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but yeah, I think I would as well.
We'll give Mark some credit. It was a good answer. So
yeah.
1-0 Mark, 1-0-0. Best finance system that you or your team have used?
It's a fairly low bar. So before I left my listed company, we were just implementing Workday, and we were moving away from PeopleSoft, which was terrible. Workday looked brilliant compared to that, so I would go with Workday.
I agree, it's a low bar. My answer is anything that is integrated into the commercial database of record. So for me, integration with Salesforce using Financial Force was a game changer. Even if you have to have a subpar financial reporting system connected to it. And I won't say which one it was.
Kelvin?
Well, my best experience has been with SAP, but I think that's because we had a really good internal head of SAP who could just work magic with it. So I think it's a combination of the system and having some good internal resource that can get the best out of it. NetSuite was also pretty good, but again, we had a really good internal resource who could really get the best out of it and integrate it with other systems and so on.
Okay, cool. Thank you, guys. In a scale up, should other areas outside of finance feed into the CFO?
I think, you know, you're probably going to have limited senior resource within there. So I would say yes, I would, you know, the ones that I think would most naturally sit would be legal, and potentially, depending upon the revenue model, potentially commercial, some commercial functions as well, and probably property as well.
And I disagree with that. I think there are arguments to be made for the different areas reporting into the CFO, including legal, HR, ops, but I disagree that it's the right approach. At a scale up, I think it's important to have strong senior talent at the heads of each of the critical functions.
Oh, that's what we wanted. Yes. Difference of opinion. Kelvin?
I think it depends on the business model. I think for 1,000 heads, where I'm at the moment, it makes a lot of sense because our CEO and other leaders are actually fee earners. So I'm responsible for HR and IT because it makes a lot of sense for me to do that. It frees them up to spend, you know, generating more fee, which is the most important thing for us.
Perfect, thank you. You don't need to give me names on this. Biggest hiring mistake? Names not required on this one.
So I mean, look, I've not directly hired hundreds of people, and I don't think I've made an absolute howler. I'd say the mistake I have made is not moving people on and hiring new people quickly enough. I think that's a really tough one. You've just got to bite the bullet, because it'll make you as an individual more effective, and actually it'll make your team more effective as well.
For me, the mistake has been when I've hired someone with the right skill set, but I had questions about his or her fit with the culture of the business, and it has never been possible to turn that around.
Wow. Okay. Kelvin?
Yeah, I don't think I've made any major sort of hiring mistakes. I think there's probably been only one person who wasn't necessarily a hiring mistake, but I think that they weren't kind of prepared for some of the challenges of working in a fast-paced, high-growth business, and they'd come from a very kind of steady kind of corporate background. So whilst they had the skill set, I think they struggled with some of the you know, the sort of challenges that may happen when you're in a business that's growing and you're implementing systems and everything doesn't necessarily work perfectly. So but they were still a very talented individual, and I know they've had a really good career since they left me. So yeah, it wasn't a bad person.
Reason, though. That wasn't. No. Best tip for managing or leading a superstar?
I'd say keep them stretched to the point that you think you're pushing them a little bit too far, and over communicate.
I would say share ideas with that person, but don't forget the rest of your employees and team, because favoritism can stand out and can impact the rest of the team negatively.
Yeah, I would give them lots of opportunities to grow and develop, but manage it sensibly. You know, some people might think that they can move on to a new role in 2 or 3 months, and that's not good for kind of managing the team. Give them lots of visibility when they've been responsible for delivering great work. Don't take credit for it yourself, and just don't hold them back. You know, if they want to move on or they want to into another, you know, if you're in a bigger business, into another role or within another team, just don't hold them back.
And final one on the quickfire round: best advice for a first-time CFO?
I'd say, embrace the responsibility of it, and the decision making and everything that comes with that. I think, you'll have been recruited into that role on merit because people think that you can do the job. And I think particularly, and I did this on my first role, if you're stepping in to what can be seen as a more experienced and established leadership team, and it's your first time role, that there could be a tendency to not quite feel like you should be at that table, or you haven't quite earned the right to be at that table yet. You've got to put that out of your head and just grab it. You're there on merit, you're there for a reason, and that team will need you to function as an effective equal. So yeah, you've got to do that out of the gate.
Yeah, my advice is about teams and relationships, so similar in some ways. It's about making sure you have a plan to get the right people around you, and that is to some extent understanding where your strengths and weaknesses are and shoring them up. Spending time getting to know the rest of the senior management team, that will make you more at ease and more comfortable, to Mark's point, that your place around the table is needed and necessary. And then finally, I have to throw in, look for controls, weaknesses and controls. That's one to fix in the first 100 days.
So Mark and Jennifer have stolen a lot of what I was going to say. So, so I'm not going. But what I would say is that I don't feel ashamed of not knowing all the answers and being the expert. Lean on as much expertise either from other CFOs that you've worked for, or in the case of Phoenix, who are 1,000 heads backers, there's a floating sort of CFO consultant who is there to speak to and get advice from. Just don't be afraid to kind of leverage as much advice as you possibly can.
And this is probably a question more for you and Mark. I just seen one in the chat box, because it's highlighting that PE-backed companies are quite hard to break into from a career perspective, especially if you've come from a listed organization or from a large company. Any tips from, or any of you really, on what a potential, someone who's doing a CFO or a divisional FD role in a listed environment or large environment can do to move into a PE-backed business? Obviously, you've done that in your last role.
Yeah. If I reflect on the interview process that I've just gone through with Phoenix, is they really didn't care about any kind of financial control, compliance type tax experience that I had. They were really interested in any experience that I'd had in driving and improving financial performance. And if you think about it, that's all really a private equity firm kind of really care about. So one of the things that I have done over the years is try to get involved in projects that allowed me to either support that or lead that. That would be my biggest tip.
Cool. Mark, anything to add to that?
I think it feels like there's some sort of secret sauce and mythical skill set sometimes if you sort of read a lot of the job postings that will be on LinkedIn. My experience of being in there so far is that actually there isn't, and if you've had good rounded experience in a public company environment or another private company environment, for me it will be more about the experience than actually having been in a PE place. So I think try and find ways to make the experience that you've had relevant to the journey that the business is going on.
Perfect. Jem, we'll go to you on the next question, because we're now into kind of more not serious questions, because they were all serious questions, but just in terms of your day-to-day role, how would you describe that currently in terms of a proportion of time spent in different areas?
Yeah, I mean, this does vary with the point in the life cycle that your business is in. I would say in general, for a PE-backed business, a lot of time is taken between very important, critical, informal discussion with the other members of the senior leadership team. You can think of the CFO as essentially I think of the CFO as being the main communication and conduit between the commercial sides of the business and the communication of that. And the other one is constant communication with the shareholder. And perhaps it goes without saying, but in the PE-backed businesses I've worked for, it's constantly on WhatsApp, it's on phone calls, making sure that there's an informal level of communication alongside your formal, and that should be monthly and quarterly updates to the board and shareholders.
Mark, Kelvin, anything to add to that from a ratio of your time on different elements of the role?
Do you want to go, Mark?
I think sorry, go on, Kelvin.
I was going to say, I agree with Jennifer, it really depends on where you are in the investment life cycle. If you spoke to me a year ago at MetaSwitch, I would have said that 75% of my time was on fundraising and exit process, maybe more. I think, where I am currently, I probably spend 40-50% of my time on what I call kind of commercial matters, maybe even more. There's just a range of projects that I'm either leading or I'm doing or that are all associated with kind of driving the business forward, either operationally or from a financial performance perspective. And then I find, Jennifer, the investor relations piece I think is important. Is actually one of the things I've got my 3-month review tomorrow, and it's one of the things I think I want to be doing more of with Phoenix. But we do actually speak to them every 2 weeks, and then probably in between those, because I speak to the investment director just to kind of an ad hoc catch up of what's going on. But I think I think the informal piece is really important from an investor relations perspective. It's not like when you're in a listed business where you have your quarterly or half yearly results announcements, and that's when you talk to your shareholders. You've got to remember that they're a very active majority shareholder, and they want to know what's going on all the time.
Yeah, I'd say similar. I think I'm probably roughly 50% commercial, 25% sort of finance stuff, which would include reporting and budgeting and forecasting, and then 25% sort of leadership, board and investor comms.
And to stay with you, Mark, obviously you've done the listed CFO piece and now the private equity piece, and Jen and Kelvin have also you've been involved in exits and the IPOs. How have you gone about, or how have you approached new challenges in your career when it's probably slightly out your comfort zone? It must feel like the first time you do a roadshow, surely.
Yeah, I remember that one. Very well. Trudging around New York, going from faceless office building to the next. I think, and someone mentioned it earlier, don't be afraid to think that you need to have all of the answers. There will hopefully be people around you who have also got some responsibility for that area and can help you along the way. So don't be afraid and don't be shy to ask questions, and listen as much as you can when people are advising and are in and around you. And I think also try and just sort of break something down into its individual component parts, figure out how you're going to tackle them, and then bring it all back together again.
Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good advice. And when I thought about this question, all I have to say sounds very cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is to become an expert in something, you have to have a first time in it. And it's inevitable that you will make mistakes. But by the same token, when I look back on my first time IPO or sale processes and that type of thing, those were some of the most fun moments of my career. And the rest just isn't as interesting because it's not an opportunity to learn. And if you have the intellectual curiosity that's brought you to this point in your career so far, I think facing a first-time challenge in one of these corporate transactions should be seen as a point of excitement.
It's a good point. Very good point. Kelvin?
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of the things that Mark and Jennifer said. I think the other thing that I would say is that if I think back to some of the things that I've done for the first time, i.e. like an IPO, the big lesson that I learned and I think that worked really well with market. And when we started preparing for the MetaSwitch IPO, which never materialized, was get the advisors in early, get them in early, and get as much advice from them in terms of what's worked and what hasn't worked and other transactions that they've worked on. So for an IPO, it's all about preparation. You know, it's really about preparation, and as much as you can do that in advance is good. And then I think the other thing is, you know, when it comes to challenges, again, as I've said earlier, seek external advice. I remember when I was at MetaSwitch and being you know, able to go and present to the board for the first time at a quarterly earnings announcement. I'd never presented at a board before. So I just spent a lot of time with my CFO, kind of rehearsing questions and going through how I was going to tackle particular kind of issues that had come up during the quarter and how we positioned them, and get that kind of that feedback. And you know, and every time you do it, you get better. I remember the first time I did my first board presentation. There's a guy called Colin Hiles, who's an executive coach, who just happened, I'd been on a course with him, and he just happened to be in our offices coaching our leadership team whilst just after I'd done my first board presentation. And I said, oh, he asked me how it went, and I went, oh, I don't know, I didn't feel like I answered this question very well, and I stumbled a bit on this. And he just said to me, he goes, I'll tell you something, every CEO he's ever worked with is depressed because they focus on gaps and not growth. So he said just focus on the fact that your muscles are growing and that you know what you've just been through has helped you grow. So but you know, and that's always stuck with me. Whenever I feel like I'm doing something that's making me feel a bit uncomfortable or it's a challenge, I was always trying to remind myself that I'm feeling uncomfortable because I'm growing, and that's a good thing.
That's a really good analogy. Really good analogy.
Add something to that, Andrew. It came up while you were speaking, but I'm not sure if those of you on the call know each other already. But I also do have to say, on a very practical level, if you use these type of opportunities to get to know others in similar situations or with similar ambitions, I frequently do phone a friend when I have questions about what to do in my role, and I think that's a great way to learn from other people.
Yeah, agreed. Really good points, guys. Kelvin, you're in your first 100 days just still. What did you did you make a 100-day plan? Is it a 60-day plan? What did you do? What was in it?
I didn't formally sit down and say these are the things I was going to do in the 100 days. I had a very clear idea though of what I wanted to do. The first thing I wanted to do is, and this is a bit of advice I got years ago from a lady called Julia Wilson, who's a CFO at 3i, which is really spend those first 4-6 weeks getting out and meeting as many people as you can in the business. You get the sort of luxury of a bit of free time when you join a business typically. And so I spent a lot of time making sure I was really visible, working with the commercial teams to understand what their challenges were. I also spent a lot of time digging into the control and compliance and governance environment within the team to make sure that there were no gaps, and thankfully there weren't. But it's the, you know, I always call it the sleep at night analogy. You don't want to be worried about kind of fraud or you know, control breaches or anything like that. Yeah, and then I made sure that I sat down and came up with what my 9 to 12 month plan. That's the one thing I did do, is because I think 100 days is 100 days, but what I then did is come up with what I thought, having met lots of people in the business, assess what the finance team were doing well and not well, come up with, you know, all the things I think we needed to do over a 12-month time frame, and then agreed that plan with my CEO as well to make sure that we were both aligned in terms of what we saw the priorities as being.
Mark, you did, if you did a 100-day plan, you did half of it in the office, half of it in lockdown. Yeah, did you have a 100-day plan? Do you like that idea? What was in it?
Yeah, I think it was good to do, and I had a bit of time off in between my two roles, so I had a bit of a luxury of being able to spend some time thinking about it. But at the very highest level, I sort of break it down into, you know, 30 days listening and reading, you know, a bit like Kelvin just talked about, you know, get out and meet as many people as you can. Next 30 days, you know, framing my hypothesis on what I'd found and what I wanted to do, and just road testing that, because even with all the listening, you're not gonna understand the business fully in 30 days. And then in the third 30 days, try and get to execution and chalk up a few quick wins.
Great. Jennifer? Yeah,
I think there's a lot of overlap with my first 100 days. And incidentally, I bought a book that said your first 100 days as a CFO. And when I got to my first CFO role, and it said pretty much what Mark and Kelvin had laid out there. But I would add one other thing, which is that your first 100 days will likely see you go to your first board meeting. And I think that's a really important place to set the tone. And my advice would be to begin preparing for the board meeting 1 month in advance of its occurrence, to lay out your vision, to understand the previous vision that's been set by the CEO and whether or not there's any need or room to kind of set out some KPIs initially from finance, because that first impression is quite important. And the sort of formal feedback that you give to the board at that point will orient the next 9 to 12 months.
Side note, because it's really interesting, your first board meeting, you've obviously spoken about planning it a month in advance. Is there a danger, would you have done it differently, any of you, or do you think there's a danger you can almost build up that moment and make it more nerve-wracking and intense than it actually is? Or is the right approach to think about it a month in advance?
Well,
go on, you go.
Sorry. Well, you know my view on that in advance is the right thing to do. But I would add to that further that you should aim to send something out to the board at least 48 hours in advance, so that you give yourself the space not to be chasing last minute changes and be stressed about what you're going to put in the content of the board pack, and really rehearse with your speech or your note cards or your bullet points, because there's nothing that helps you feel more prepared than preparation.
Kelvin?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think my first board meeting, I just made sure I knew the numbers inside out and tried to second guess every potential question that would come up. And actually quite a few of the things I thought of did come up, so I was glad that I'd done that research. The only thing I'd say that it's been a little bit different for me with Phoenix relative to other investors that I've worked with is that we have board meetings every 2 weeks, and they were everyone, even the chairman, and were very keen to stress that they don't like formality. They don't like things looking too and feeling too stage managed. So they wanted it to, you know, they kind of had the approach where it's not like you're going to the headmaster and having your homework marked. What they say is it's shared decisions, shared responsibilities. That's the way that Phoenix works. So that kind of actually made me feel quite a lot more relaxed about walking into the boardroom with Phoenix relative to you know, how I maybe felt in other situations where I've been asked to present at the board level.
Any thoughts on that, Mark? Otherwise, I'll jump into the next question for you.
I mean, very quickly, I'd just say, you know, try and get from your CEO in advance of it, you know, the dynamics of the board, because, you know, it'll be different for every board. And whilst there will be a lot of pressure on yourself to be focusing on what you're delivering, try and make sure you keep your ears open and be sort of picking up that board dynamic yourself, and that'll set you up well for future meetings.
And what's your first priority when it comes to the team, your direct team?
I think I wrote something down for this. I can't remember what I put now. I mean, I think it's you've got to make sure that you've got the right people around you. I think, you know, and that you've got people doing stuff that they want to be doing. You've got to keep them motivated, but having the right structure underneath you, I think, is really important. Because otherwise, you could be the best CFO in the world, but if you're forever firefighting because your team, your team's not doing what you need them to do, then you won't be successful.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, I think this depends on each person's management style, but for me, this means autonomy for my direct reports, and acknowledgement and connection to the people who are down in the trenches doing the work.
Kelvin?
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add is one of the things I always like to do is try and build really strong trust-based relationships. Yeah, I think it's when you first join a new business, I think there's always a little bit of nervousness, I suspect, from the team members in terms of what you're like and so on. And I always like to make sure that I kind of have a full picture of what's good and bad. And I think you only can do that by kind of being very open with them. If you find, if a mistake gets picked up, don't be kind of too hard on them, just kind of help them solve the problems and so on. So, because I think it bears fruit in the long run. You just don't want people hiding things from you when they go wrong. So,
and do you personally prefer a number 2 in a head of finance role, or do you prefer a controller and a head of commercial finance or head of FP&A? And at what point would you split that if that is your preference?
So the last 2 businesses, what I've had is the sort of the traditional group financial controller, group or head of FP&A split, and that's worked well given the sizes of the business. I haven't done that at 1,000 heads because the business is just a lot smaller, and I've got a really strong financial controller who's been with the business for 13 years, who knows everything inside out, and the commercial finance FP&A lead reports to her, and there's no upside for me to change that relationship. I can still work given the size of the team, there's only 5 of us. I can still work effectively with both of them without having to have a kind of a formal change of management responsibility.
Yeah, Jennifer, your thoughts on that?
It really does depend on the size of the team and also the background of the CFO. So for me, I don't have a technical accounting background. So for me, what's very important is a strong sort of FD controller structure. It's not necessary for me to have a separate head of commercial or head of FP&A, although I do believe that having a talented individual looking after the analytical side of finance is important somewhere in the team for a PE-backed business.
And Mark?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it comes down to the size of the business. In my previous role, I had it split. In my current role, it all comes under one individual. I think the time to think about splitting it, I think, comes when you're sort of seeing that basically there's compromises being made on sort of both sides of that fence, because the individual can't spread themselves sufficiently, and that for me is the moment to split it.
You've obviously all joined new businesses in the last 12 months, and some of those businesses would have had established boards and established CEOs or founders there. How do you approach an established board CEO as a new CFO around building that business partnering relationship and being able to influence? We'll go with you again, Mark, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think for me, going into the sort of cyberspace, it's certainly compared to my previous business, it's pretty complicated, and I went into a founder situation, so they will have forgotten more about cyber than I will ever learn over the next 4 years. But I think particularly with founders, they'll probably be in and around that space for quite some time, so they won't necessarily have the broader perspective that you will have had in a finance role from working in potentially in other industries and other businesses. So I think that's what you can bring to bear, the sort of fresh ideas. And something that I use quite often is, because finance see a lot of what your business is doing when you're buying services from other people, you can put yourself in the shoes of your customer and understand how they will be looking at what it is that you're trying to sell to them. And I think you can bring that perspective to the sort of commercial table and to the CEO quite well.
Jennifer?
Well, first of all, Mark, let me say I had the same feeling when I worked in cybersecurity. I think for me, it goes back to something Mark said earlier as well about remembering that there's a reason that there's a place at the table for you, around the table for you, which is, you know, that you bring an aspect that no one else sitting around the senior management table can bring. And for me, that unique aspect, particularly in a PE-backed business, is about KPIs. It's about being able to take the story, listen to the CEO, listen to the experts of the business and the industry, take their stories and distill them down to KPIs that can be repeated back to a financial audience in a way that's quickly understandable in a kind of elevator pitch way. I feel that in some ways I haven't answered your question, but
you have. I think that's a great answer.
These are things that CFOs are really good at doing. That takes the skills from the CEO and those who are experts in the industry and does something really useful with them.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point, and one that it's just nice to remind, you know, people that are CFOs on boards. It's just nice to remind yourself that you're on the board because they asked you to be on the board. You've all earned your right already, so it gives you that self-confidence, doesn't it? And Kelvin, your thoughts on that? I know you're very big into your social media platforms already, so
I am an absolute,
you're a bit of a specialist in that area.
My phone is loaded with TikTok and Instagram and all the other ones. But no, I mean, I think you have to recognise when you come into this, into a new role, is that you know, I could never profess to be an expert on sort of social media marketing and strategies and so on. It's just not my skill set. But you know, a little bit like Jennifer and Marcus, they've hired me hopefully for a reason. That's the reason that I've worked for big companies, medium-sized companies, and so on, and that I can bring some knowledge and expertise, not just from a financial perspective. And one of the things that I tried to do and did do was throw myself into a project where I felt like I had a bit more expertise than anyone else within the business, and that was actually that 1,000 heads, we'd never had a business development or sales function. They'd never existed. So I threw myself into that in terms of developing our CRM tool, developing the KPIs, designing the commission and the bonus scheme for those teams in a way that was sort of broadly consistent with what I'd seen in other businesses, kind of using the old adage of you know what good looks like, and trying to use that because that was all new stuff to them. I can't teach them any more about some of the kind of the KPIs that they lived and breathed, because it's a consulting business. It's utilization, it's over servicing, it's stuff that they know, and they're well-defined KPIs and have been living them for 15, 20 years. So I've tried to come in and introduce some new things that they've not necessarily seen before, and build my credibility that way.
Would you say, and this is a question to all of you, that there's that the CFO needs to be more relaxed about trying to prove their commercial awareness in a sector they're not a specialist?
I'd say I think you have to, the people around you will know that that's not necessarily your field of expertise, and I think that will be accepted and allowed, and they will know that when you bring when they bring you into the business. My company I knew zero about cyber coming in. I think what you need to do to sort of have credibility with your peers is that you've got to put a lot of effort in to actually learning it, and actually, not just focus on the finance side of it, but really understanding the business that you're in and the business model that they're operating in, and not stay on the periphery of it.
Jennifer?
I was on mute there. It was bound to happen. I would almost disagree with the idea that you should be relaxed about commercial. I do think that no one's expecting you to come in and being an expert about the business. But I think that's what makes a great private equity CFO, is to be, and I'm sorry for using this term again, intellectually curious about the business model, the commercial, the ecosystems, the customer journey. This is what can differentiate you from CFOs who simply bring their technical background.
Yep. Kelvin?
Yeah, the thing I was going to say is a little bit like Jennifer. The thing that I've done is I'm genuinely very enthusiastic about what we do as a business, and I've tried to learn and read kind of external publications, listen to podcasts and so on that are focused on our space. And actually, one of the ones I listen to when I'm working out is called Social Pros, and it's all about, it's two social media marketing experts interviewing other social media marketing experts. And actually, off the back of those, it's meant that I've been able to, when I've spoken to our UK or US heads of business, I've just heard this interview with so and so from Cisco, and they were doing this. Wouldn't that be a cool thing to do? Or I found there's a Salesforce state of marketing article that they reference, and I downloaded that and read it and shared it with my CEO and said, "Oh, there's some interesting things in here." Now, sometimes they just look at me and just think, he doesn't really know what he's talking about, but that's not quite relevant to our, myself. That's not quite relevant to our business, but I hope that it shows that you've got a genuine, I've got a genuine enthusiasm and curiosity for the business. And whilst I might have 20 ideas or suggestions, and maybe only one will resonate with them, I think that's probably good enough. I think.
That's a good point. You and all three of you have led company-wide plans, whether it be an IPO or an M&A piece. And how have you communicated that to the team below? What sort of elements of communication do you give to the team below when you're going through something 1 year ahead or 6 months ahead? What did you do at market or other places, Kelvin?
So when it came to the IPO, we started prepping about 18 months before we actually IPO'd. It was definitely a very secret squirrel exercise. So when we started, I think there was only 6 people in the whole of the company that knew what we were doing: CEO, CFO, 2 or 3 of us in finance, and a general counsel. And that was just to make sure the business didn't, the general employee base didn't get too excited and start thinking about, what they'd spend their share proceeds on. And that's been consistent actually with, the process I went through at Metaswitch. We kept it within a very, very small, tight group for a very, very long time. And actually, before we sold to Microsoft, we were going through a private equity sponsorship fundraising process, and it didn't go as well as we wanted it to. And the CEO actually made a mistake of telling the senior leadership team that we were going through that process. And when it didn't happen, I think it led to some disappointment and some questions as to why it hadn't been successful. And thankfully, 4 weeks later, Microsoft came out of the woodwork and made an offer. But my big lesson through both those processes is only tell people when they really, really need to. People don't need to worry about what you're doing from a fundraising perspective. They just need to be, continually focused on running the business up, running the business.
What did you do with your day-to-day finance team whilst that was going on?
So with the IPO, we knew we were planning it even before we started the kind of kicking off the process, which was 18 months. We knew probably about 6 months before that we were going to IPO. So I actually hired some people to effectively cover for me when I knew what I was going through that. We're going to be going through that IPO process. The challenge with that, frankly, is that when you've done the IPO, you kind of then think, well, what am I going to do next? Because you brought people in to do, effectively what might have been your kind of previous day job. But that's fine, Then you sort of try and find kind of new opportunities for yourself.
And Jennifer, your thoughts on secret
Yeah,
store meeting?
unfortunately, it does usually need to be a kind of silence thing when you're thinking about a strategic exit or an IPO for the reasons Kelvin mentioned. I do think for some transactions, some M&A and fundraising transactions, it's useful to tell your team, or at least your direct reports, and to delegate your authority where you're important in the day-to-day running of the business to the person you trust on the team, the controller, the FD.
And Mark, from an M&A perspective, you obviously need someone in the inner circle to work on the deals as you're growing the business, but is that slightly different than an IPO? Can you let more people involved in that?
I think if you're on the buy side, I think you certainly can do, and I'd agree with what both Jennifer and Kelvin said. You start off with a pretty small tent, and then as you go through the process, just to make the process work, you've got to widen that tent and bring more people in. I'd say the only sort of caveat to that I would give, particularly when you're thinking about your finance team, is people aren't stupid, right? And if in the last 3 years you've never asked them to pull a certain set of data together, or you're suddenly asking for reams and reams of data, like, people are going to go there in a heartbeat, and therefore you're often better to bring them in and level set than be trying to make up excuses that they'll know are not quite there. I think if you know something's going to be coming at some point in the future, then in something I'm doing now within my current company, and we're unlikely to exit for a number of years, but we're sort of maintaining sort of data files and stats, and KPI runners and everything else, such that if at any point in time I need to throw loads of information over to an investment bank to pull together an IM, then the information's already there, so you can get on with a lot of that without then bringing a lot more people in. So to the extent you can be preparing as you go, I think that can sometimes take away some of that pressure on communication.
Well, everyone, that was actually the last question, which you answered, and it's now 9 o'clock, so I'm actually quite impressed. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any quick questions? We've gone through a lot, but if anyone has any quick questions, we probably have got time for a couple. One come through from Zoe. When there is a great business case for multiple projects but limited time resource, what are your learnings when it comes to helping the business prioritize and focus on execution? I don't know if you can see that question as well. I think you can. Who would like to answer that question?
That's a very good and tricky question.
But it's from Zoe. She's quite sharp, so she would have thrown one in there to make it quite tricky.
Yeah, it is tricky, and well, that's a good problem to have, and I've never found the perfect solution to this problem. But one thing I will say is that the CFO, the CFO's team, is best placed to help the business make that decision based on financial factors and stick to it. If resources need to be allocated away from profitable projects to something that's more profitable.
Kelvin?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd probably add as well, you want to, if there are major trade-offs to take place, you want to work with the CEO to get alignment within the leadership team, because what you have to stop in that situation are sort of pet projects that are going on off the side of the desk, and really focus down on the whatever it is, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that are really strategically important for the business.
Next one, which is interesting actually, because I am intrigued to see what your answer to this is. How do you approach succession planning, especially during exits? And actually, do you think about succession planning when it comes to exits, or do you just think about succession planning for your team below? Kelvin?
I think it depends on the nature of the exit. I think from an IPO perspective, what I put a lot of thought into was what would the shape of the team need to look like when we were a public company versus being a private company. Once we knew that we were definitely going to IPO, made sure that we were hiring those people or moving internal people into the roles that we needed to kind of deal with the pressures of quarterly earnings announcements and so on. So doing that early. I wouldn't necessarily say that on the other exits we've sort of thought too much about sort of succession planning. You know, to some extent there was kind of an awareness that certain people would probably move on, and you just kind of need to make sure that you've got, you know, a strong enough bench further down the team that could cover that. And if not, just be prepared that if the individual leaves, that you might need to you know, go out to the market and hire someone to replace them.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I agree that it's important to think about succession planning, that as gauche as it sounds, you need to think about people's motivations on the senior team and plan together and be open with others. I personally have never felt bad about putting myself out of a job by successfully selling a business, but some people don't feel that way, and I think being transparent with the team is helpful. In terms of planning for the team below you, I also think that shouldn't go without a lot of thought and planning, but Kelvin covered that, and I think his answer was spot on.
Mark?
I think all that add is, you know, start thinking about it, you know, long before an exit, you know, almost as soon as you get into that business and take on that role, start to think about how that team can evolve and who your successor might be, and don't assume that it will be one of your direct reports. You know, if you're going to be around in an organization for 3, 4, 5 years, you know, then it's quite likely, you know, that it could actually be somebody one level down from that. But start thinking about it early.
Perfect. Well, look, I just want to say thank you to the three of you again for taking your time out this evening, and thanks to everyone else that could make it. I will see you all soon, and it's Friday tomorrow, so and Monday is a special day also. Enjoy some lockdown easing over the next few weeks, and yeah, thanks everyone again for joining.
No problem. Thanks for arranging it.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Kelvin. See you later.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.